than a lot of the other ones. So I'm going to start off with a poem, and it's the first one, Meeting My Son. My son came to me first as news, as a photo, as a fully formed shock, his already opened eyes sharing with me the bewilderment of a new world. Then he became a living and breathing choice, out of the city and beyond the trees, and past anywhere a road can take me. He lived in a world separate from mine, that I could have kept separate. It felt cruel to get what I always wanted, a child, in a way so different than how I wanted it. But my son was beautiful, even when he was abstract. And when you have the chance to entwine your life with something beautiful, it is unwise to complain about how. While I was waiting to meet my son, the opposing forces of fear and photos would occasionally pop up and casually decide for me if I'm spending my day bound to bed or announcing through still awkward phone calls this source of joy, this thing of beauty. But mostly I just live my life and let this changed circumstance, a son I've never met, gradually become normal. What I wanted, a chance to meet my son, came to me in a way I never wanted. My son was flying in because my son has had a seizure. He holds my finger, we make faces at each other, he giggles. The travel and the hospital and I are all new to him, but at 5 months old, things being new to him isn't new to him. He's sleepy but fussy, like any other time he misses his nap. His mother shows me that I can calm him by placing my hand on his heart. I rest it there. I can feel his heartbeat. I'm thinking about all this strange world could hold for us. But as I feel his heart slow down, I can feel my heart slow down. And I think about this moment. So that poem is about one of the most powerful experiences in my life, and of meeting my son. It's a kind of a unique scenario. And I believe that these kinds of experiences are what really form teachers' praxis, and my praxis in particular. Like, it's not, we talk about it as if we read a book about, like, read the QEP, we read a few books, and then we go, okay, like this part. But no, these are the things that form who you are as a teacher. And so I'm hoping to, through this capstone, I explored these formative moments, and I kind of mined them for pedagogical material to kind of understand like what are my central tenets and how did I get there. And in the case I came up with, the biggest thing I took away from is the essentialness of reciprocity, that as a teacher you receive just as much as you give. And that you would acknowledge the opportunities to learn from the students, and that empowers them, but also it helps you move through your life. So I chose that first poem. That first poem is the starting point of the capstone as well. And I make it the starting point not because it happened first. A lot of what happened is about my experience in the North before, but it really shapes the way I experience the North, and I understand the North. And it helps humanize the Inuit life and Inuit issues, as much as obviously I had a lot of empathy through my initial experiences. Like, having a kid and integrating into the community changed it from empathy as an outsider into a person living these issues. And it also restarted my writing practice. So after that poem I wrote in the hospital waiting room. And then over the next 2 years, I wrote over 100 pages of poetry, which is what I used as my data source. So I took those poems, that's ahead of it. The reason why I chose poetry is because it was, because my experience in the North was quite, while it's quite dramatic, the having a son from a one-night stand and then finding out about him, and like, after he exists, and then like suddenly being integrated into this community, it's quite dramatic, but it's also kind of in some ways common and universal that people who go to the North, like once you've been to the North, like it leaves with you. Like, everybody carries that community with them when they've been there, especially if they spent any time engaging with the people there. So I think that's where poetry shines best, where there's the universal and the particular. And it also lends itself really well to subjectivity, and this is especially important as a Qallunaat. Qallunaat is it's an Inuit word for, it's eyebrow belly, because our eyebrows are big like our bellies for white people or non-Inuit. And I think it's really important that I use the subjective medium when I talk about my experience in the North, because I don't want to be talking about it as if I know what the North is, because I'm just the guy that's, as much as I feel integrated because I have a kid there now, like I'm also just a guy that's been there for a year or two. It's not, I don't have access to the truth. I want to explore my truth without pretending I have access to the truth. And lastly, poetry, like it humanizes issues in a way that like I can list off statistics and I can talk about inequalities, but when you hear about these human voices, and it's what really enacts change. So I took those 100 poems and I sorted them into themes. The major themes I titled, it was My Son and Myself, Coping with Trauma, Understanding Inuit Culture, and finally Reciprocation in Action. And so tonight I'm going to take a little bit from each section and just kind of rocket through it. It ended up being like 60 pages. So for the first one, for My Son and Myself, that first poem I read was part of it. And the next one that I'm going to read is also from it, and it's from the fall of 2018. I got a chance to go back there. I got to work in the Inukjuak again, and then I got to be able to spend time with my son. And then I was starting to see his development. And so I wrote a series of poems about him learning the kind of basic skills, and this is one of them. It's called Peekaboo. You realize things aren't even when you shave and your son sees you as a stranger. The part of you he grasps the most is gone. To him, you are the subtraction of fur and love, shaved in half. There are 3 stages to learning peekaboo. Eventually, it will be played only in irony. So silly that one could be fooled by that. But at first, it is a game of true fear. Atata disappears, then miraculously returns with a laugh of relief. In between, the laugh grows into a laugh of recognition, as he learns that you're still there underneath the blanket, even when you're unseen. You think of this second stage as you prepare to part, and pray he has time to learn it. So what's important about that poem, and this series of poems, that having a kid really is got me more invested in learning. I'm more invested in my son learning these basic skills than I have been in anything else. So, like I taught, I obviously cared, but like it's so important that he learns these things, and particularly this skill of like the kind of cognitive skill of understanding that I'm away, and that the kind of complicated things you have to get, that I'm here to finish my education and then come back there. I didn't just disappear. And so, and the other thing from these series that you gather is that that we all learn so much as babies, like kind of an incredible amount, and we do it with ruthless drive forward. Like you never get a baby go like, I'm not going to learn to talk. It's because like they just keep doing it. They don't have the same emotional or social barriers, and so watching an infant is one of the things that can really remind you as a teacher that the things that make kids quit are not something inherent in themselves. They're not quitters. They've been programmed into being quitters. And okay, so for the next section, it's on trauma. And so as a teacher in the North, you encounter there's a lot of tragedy in the North, or at least in the northern community I was in. And you experience both first. I've experienced both first and a lot of secondhand trauma. And secondhand trauma is a term for the stress that you can receive. You can get traumatic stress just from being in contact with people with a lot of traumatic stress. It's something that I hadn't heard of until I started having nightmares, and Googled it. And so the next poem is about a very traumatic thing for me. just before I started my first internship, this was back in 2017 or 2018, January 2018. I learned that one of my co-teachers told me that that a student of mine, Max, who was a student that I was very close with, had murdered somebody. He's somebody that had seemed to have some mental health issues, and so when I heard this, it totally broke my heart, and I had to take a leave of absence. And then later I learned that it was actually a different student of mine named Matt. Like, she just had the names confused, and there was this weird relief followed by guilt, right? Like this, I'm really glad it's not Max, this student that I connected with so much, but then like, well, how am I feeling good about that when it's another kid that I was responsible for that kind of came away with this, that kind of shortly after he was in my class. So it's called Part of Me. Part of me felt guilty that I felt better learning was one student and not the other that did it. Although everything I said to myself was as true or untrue for one or the other, it was my job to teach them life skills, how to keep a job, how to save your money, but not how to care for others or express your anger without killing someone. They both showed signs of needing care, which I did not ignore, but also did not have enough to do enough. And somehow the fact that it was not my favorite student, whose humanity failed him and he choked the life out of a young woman, somehow that made me feel better. So this poem, at this point, I was left with a lot more questions than answers. As a teacher, like, how do you balance caring for other teachers, which I think is so essential to my praxis? Like, how do you balance being invested in their lives and invested in their well-being, and your own need for self-protection? How do you know where your responsibilities end, and how do you handle what's out of your control? A big part of the difficulty was learning for me that your role can be a big one, but it's also always a small one. It's a bit of a paradox that you can have a big role in a kid's life, but in the end, you're a stick in the stream. There's so much else going on in their lives that things are going to happen, and not to have too much hubris and to think that it's something that you would ever be able to do. And so from trauma, I kind of turned to an understanding of Inuit culture. And so there's two aspects to this section in my capstone. One of it's about culturally relevant teaching, which I think is super important. But the part that fits in more with the narrative, so it's going to talk more about in this presentation, is their culture engaging with their culture as a way of dealing with trauma. And so connecting with Inuit culture was a way of healing for the Inuit and inspiring hope for me. So I'm going to read the next poem called Feast. In November, Northtown had a feast, celebrating a year without suicide. Caribou, all three ways, boiled, raw, and frozen. 4 types of fish and ptarmigan, plucked. The flesh of the land, the meat we are made of, laid out on cardboard to share strength for the year ahead. So I wrote this one this spring. It was shortly after I heard about the suicide of a student in the north. Not one of my students, but I heard about the suicide of the student who had been friends with some of the students in my class, and so I knew around. It's in these communities there aren't really people you don't know, it was also one of the first pieces of really tragic news to come out of Inukjuak after I had heard about my son, after I got to know my son. And so it was more difficult to deal with than other ones because, as I said, like with the son, I'm no longer empathizing. I'm living the things that happen in the community. And this poem is kind of bittersweet in the end, though, because it's obviously tragic that suicide is common enough that even in this village of 2,000 people, you need to celebrate having a year without suicide. But the focus is really on the hope and the beauty of the community and the way in which they kind of, the meat is just laid out, they're feeding each other just the raw food and the raw emotions of caring for each other and protecting each other and loving each other in face of these tragic and difficult things are that's very beautiful to me, and that's where I found a lot of the healing. And so finally, this brings me to reciprocation. I came to reciprocation. Well, obviously, it was always something that I kind of believed. I liked Freire when I read him. It's always cool. I always when I was a kid, I learned to like teaching because you learn when you teach. But the real power of it I learned when I started learning about Inuit culture, and I started learning it from my students. And that's when I really saw that we had a lot to give each other, and that this was a real source of power for them. So I'm going to read the next poem. The passion is in the patience. Standing over the stove, you cook 10 burgers on 4 pans, flipping constantly the still defrosting patties. I tell you, dude, you don't have to flip them so much. It's actually better if you wait a bit. You nod slowly as if you heard something very wise. A couple days before, I ran into you on the road. You were surprised to see me, happy to see you. I haven't been going to school. I've noticed. You explained that you've been missing school because you were afraid that I would be angry at you for missing school. It had been months since our class had gone for a walk out onto the land to the Inukshuk. Most of the boys cut out to go to the stores, but you stayed with us, or more accurately, walked out ahead of us, leading the way with my dog, the two of you always waiting at the top of the next hill, sitting side by side. When you came back to school, you went straight to the counselor. You had not eaten in days. After school, I pulled you aside and asked if you wanted to make yourself a burger. You asked if you could make one for someone else too. As many as you'd like. Then you went around the school asking everybody who was still around. Now you're standing over the stove, waiting for those burgers to be ready to be flipped. You tell me, the passion is in the patience. And I nod slowly, as if I had heard something very wise. Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. I love that poem. And that poem was actually written about Max, the student who thought had committed the murder while I was under the impression that he'd committed the murder. And there's kind of two aspects to this, to his Inuit, the way in which he expresses his Inuit culture that really speak to things that I want to learn about. One is his independence, his ability to just be out on the land by himself or out with my dog and just happily go out there and sit at the top of the hill and wait for everybody. And the other side of it is obviously the power of his generosity. The kind of the being so hungry that you need food. You could see that he needed food on his body, and yet his first thought was still about, oh, can I give this to everybody? And the way in which the spirit of giving, it wasn't like the what people received from him was so much more than just getting the burgers. And he transformed this advice that I give him, the simple advice about like cooking, like flipping your burgers once, it's gonna dry out. And he turns this into the passion is in the patience. This like, I think very profound phrase that this idea, and this is an idea I apply in my life everywhere. The idea that loving is really waiting, and that especially I apply this also to my students. I think about this as the way you really show that you care about your students is by giving them a little time to see what they can come up with, and waiting to see what they're able to do before you just assume. I talked to him about this later, and it was a source of great pride for him. And that's where you can see the empowering aspect of reciprocation coming into play. And so the final poem I read, I'm going to read is about last fall. I taught at a girls' rehabilitation center, also in Northtown. That's how I got to be back with my son. This was a place where for girls with the really severe emotional behavior problems. That it was a semi-locked unit. They're kind of always under watch for suicide or for violence, or they couldn't exist in the regular foster system or the regular school system. So this poem is about a student there. One of the most challenging ones, Becca, who's a 13-year-old who had fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a brain disorder if your parents drink while they were pregnant with you, and it's called Fake Teacher. You had an amazing eye for my moments of self-doubt. That's when you'd always call me Fake Teacher. You got the other girls on it. Fake Teacher. Every chance when I misspoke or misspelled, or forgot to hand out a paper, or something didn't make sense to you instantaneously, Fake Teacher. I'd been warned about this by the last teacher. He'd done the same thing to her last year. Now she's become the measure of a real teacher. Still, Fake Teacher has a weight to it, since I'm already in doubt about myself. You took so many by the hands into your corner, helping them clean their toys, wash their hands, having their snack, anything you could think of before the reading we had come there for. Then you pick up an English book and tell a story in the Nook-Tut, pointing at SpongeBob and giggling with the children. You seem a little lighter after. That was nice, wasn't it? Should we do that again sometime? Why never teach? Always make me do things, go to daycare, go to daycare, make them do everything for you. You're the teacher, why don't you read, Fake Teacher? Then you run off to take cigarettes from the man at the garage, away from the group. Once, we went to a community feast. You pocketed some plastic punch cups and quietly broke them into shards, hid them around the unit, and told the other girls how to find something sharp. 4 girls cut their wrists that night. One needed to get medevaced. People listen when you leave. A few weeks before I left, a dear friend of mine from Montreal died. Quick from find out cancer to being dead from it. I found out Sunday morning. I called my loved ones all day. Monday I tried to work. The girls were having breakfast while the staff had morning meeting. I decided I was too drained to work. I came out to announce why school was canceled. Stumbled on my words. Expected to hear Fake Teacher. And said you said, it's okay to cry. So I did. Yeah, so this is with Becca, I tried to connect with her a number of different ways, and it kind of continually reverted back to this combative relationship, and it got it just got progressively more combative. especially after the incident with the plastic cups, it really felt futile to engage with her humanity, or to have a human relationship with her. But then when I had this moment of showing myself to be truly vulnerable, and that's where her humanity reemerged. And so this is where I really get this idea of my importance I place on vulnerability in the classroom. I think it's extremely important, especially when you're working with vulnerable children. And yeah, this is a real moment of hope when you see a kid. It's not like Becca became a model student, but it was a moment where our relationship could change for a minute, and you know, maybe if I had more time, or even just that moment in itself is worth so much. Anyway, now I'm going to conclude this thing. So I organized this this way for a purpose. It has a progression. You know, my son is like a source of so much of my purpose and drive, and it really raised the stakes of my connection with this community. But this trauma, all of this trauma that you have to deal with if you're going to be a Qallunaat teacher in an Inuit village, or if you're going to be any teacher in an Inuit village, it's going to be an obstacle. And then the way in which I saw Inuit culture as a way of healing myself and healing for those around me, like that really leads to me understanding this true power of reciprocity and the true power of allowing people to lead you when you're normally put in a position of authority and not teaching from top down. And so that's what I learned from this experience, and I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. Any
You have time for a few questions.
You can also ask me questions while I'm drinking a glass of wine.
I do have a question if they want to humor me.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated about your process.
Okay, about this process, it was kind of a mess. So what do you want to know more about the process?
Well, now that you framed it, I kind of want to know all about it.
Well, so most of the poems I wrote before starting the capstone. I think of the ones I shared here, Feast I wrote after, but I didn't think about that at all. And Fake Teacher I wrote. With the intention of being like the closing poem of my capstone. But otherwise, they were poems that I've written kind of in response to processing the crazy life that I've had over the last couple of years, and processing, like I said, the trauma and the beauty. And then I just went through them and kind of sorted them into categories. There were a bunch at first, and then I was like, well, I can't. Like 60 pages was good enough. With 4 categories, I can't do 10 and make it a 300-page capstone. I already drove myself nuts. And then it was mostly just that in my own reflections. And obviously, I used Paulo Freire a lot, and in terms of resources, that and the Inuit Way, which is a guidebook produced by the Inuit Women's Society. So I use that as like a cultural touchstone of what Inuit written text about what Inuit culture is, and then some secondary resources because I had to have enough to fill out the paper.
So would it be fair to characterize the process as retrospective, Simon, where you've written the poems, and then your ability to articulate the learnings from the poems happens through that retrospective process? Or would it be
Yeah.
accurate to say that the learning happens through the doing and the creation of the poem?
There's learning from both. Like I definitely did learn some things from the retrospective process, and like I said, like about a third of the poems were written for the capstone, or like a good handful of poems were written for the capstone. That like that I wouldn't have written that last poem. I wouldn't have touched that if I didn't feel like I had to complete this. So that was one, it drove me forward in that. So yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. Because yeah, sometimes it was retrospective, sometimes I wrote them knowing what I was thinking about teaching, sometimes I wrote, it's kind of all over the place. Any other questions? Yeah?
Seeing as writing poetry is so appealing for you, have you tried this with your students, considering they all have so many difficulties?
The students that I've had, I've always worked with the at-risk kids, and they have mostly lacked the fundamental literacy skills that would be involved. I'm really interested in it. It's something that I've considered, but I don't really. I would know how to scaffold that for them when they, like Becca in that poem, like didn't know how to read the book about SpongeBob. Yeah. It's something I'm definitely interested in, and I've shared some of my poetry with some of my students. That's a difficult thing as well to figure out exactly. These are terrible answers to great questions. Sorry. Yeah, Mom?
I'm just curious if you have came across other papers where people use poetry to describe their experience.
I mean, this was only technically a paper. This was a memoir that I added some resources to because I put too much work into it so there are other arts-based research, but they are usually much more like they would all be able to answer his question pretty straightforwardly.
I don't know if that's true.
Or all the ones that I looked at would say like, okay, so I was going to do this teaching process and I decided to write a poem every week about one of my experiences and to think about reciprocity and or something like this. The retrospective process I didn't find much of. No, it didn't really seem much like this. They kept on telling me I could do interpretive dance, and so I was like, oh, like a series of poems is way more like a paper than that.
That's always the joke, is interpretive dance.
Yeah.
The most left-wing kind of presentation.
Any more questions, or do you guys want some wine? Let's go. You guys can keep your copies.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks.
What else is on the outside?